Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show. In this spring series of programmes, we've been looking at the changing politics of the Celtic nations of these islands, Ireland, Scotland, and in this week's programme, Wales. Today, Alex is in conversation with someone whose political career stretches back almost half a century. Lord Wigley arrived in the House of Commons as a young MP in February 1974. Now he sits in the House of Lords as Plaid Cymru's only peer of the realm. In between as leader of Plaid, the Party of Wales, he took the party to its best ever election result in the first Assembly elections of 1999 and to within a whisker of ending Labour's supremacy of Welsh politics. In this interview, he explains why Plaid, unlike the SNP, have never managed to build on that success, but argues that Brexit may be about to change the political landscape of Wales. But first to your tweets, messages and emails. And in relation to our show a couple of weeks ago with Lembit Opik and Peter Tatchell, Suzanne Campbell says, "Two heartfelt interviews last night. We sometimes forget what our politicians do after losing their seat. It's not always back to inherited family business." Absolutely so, Suzanne. Lynn Finlayson says in relation to last week's show, "Great interview with Alex Neil. What an interesting life he's had. I wish the show was an hour long, but we'll bear that in mind." Caroline says, "Fascinating, reflective and candid discussion. I hope more people take time to watch it." That's kind of you, Caroline. And finally, Arthur said, "Fascinating walkthrough of devolution history. Great interview. And a big yes to the model for an independent Scotland." Well, thanks, Arthur. And now over to Alex and David Wigley.
So I'm now joined by David Wigley. Baron Wigley, I should say. David, welcome to the Alex Salmond Show.
Thanks very much indeed, Alex.
Now, I want to take you back to your entry into politics in the early 1970s. I mean, you had a successful business career. Joining Plaid Cymru and standing for Parliament wasn't exactly a career move.
Well, when I stood the first time for Parliament in 1970, I didn't get elected. And when I went back, I was working with Mars then. I was Chief Cost Accountant there. And the head of Mars gave me a choice. He said I could have a good career with Mars. I could quite possibly have a good political career, but I couldn't have both. So I joined Hoover. I became financial controller of Hoover in Merthyr. And when I was elected in 1974, I had a drop of 50% in my salary level.
But you cleaned up the votes in Carnarvon and arrived in the House of Commons as one of two of the first Plaid Cymru MPs elected in the general election, then joined in October by the legendary Gwynfor Evans. So there's three of you in that hothouse parliament, a hung parliament through the 70s.
Indeed.
A bit of a baptism of fire.
Well, it was, but we had the company of 11 SNP, the Scotland First 11, as I recall them being called, and iconic people like Winnie Ewing, Donny Stewart, Gordon Wilson, and people like that, George Reid, of course. So we were able to work as a team at a time when the Labour government barely had a majority. They had an agreement with the Liberals, as they then were, to sustain them until 1978. But then in the winter of 78 through to 79, they were in serious trouble. And that's when a small party, of course, can do a little bit on the margins.
So it seemed that for a time that Scotland and Wales were set fair to get their assemblies or parliaments.
Well, yes,
79 was a big setback.
It was a big setback. There was a referendum then. Scotland, of course, voted to have a parliament. But because the rules had been cooked in Westminster, they didn't get over the 40% threshold, 40% of everybody, including dead people on the register. They were refused to have that devolved parliament. We in Wales had a bad result. The Labour Party, whose policy it was, of course, they were split down the middle, and people like Neil Kinnock were leading the campaign against devolution at that time, and it was 4-1 majority against. And I'll be honest, I thought that probably in my lifetime the thing was dead then. But over the subsequent couple of decades, things did change, and I was glad to be in a position to influence those changes.
In your own constituency, you went triumphantly on from larger majority to larger majority, although many of your SNP colleagues at that time fell by the wayside in the aftermath of the Tory victory of 79.
Well, yes, of course. The 79 vote of confidence was a phenomenal vote when Labour lost by 1 vote. And that was a vote from Northern Ireland who came along and abstained in person. It was a historic time. We had negotiated a package with the Labour government, important things like compensation for slate quarrymen and half a dozen other things, which they did deliver, fair play to them. Although they lost by 1 vote, there was a scramble to get things through at the end. The SNP had voted against the Labour government, And I think they paid the price in the subsequent election, and there were some lessons to be learned, no doubt. And I think you were in the process then, Alex, of teaching people what those lessons were.
Well, you yourself then became president, leader of Plaid Cymru, succeeding Gwynfor Evans, who I think had been president for 35 years.
He had.
So as still a relatively young politician, becoming leader of your party, but having the great setback of the referendum in Wales of 1979, how did you take the party forward? What did you think the prospects for Plaid Cymru's success were?
Well, of course, we were fairly well divided at that time. I had an election against my parliamentary colleague, David Ellis-Thomas, and I just sneaked in by, as somebody said, a busload of votes, which I'd succeeded in organising.
Where did you get the bus from?
Well, we got it locally, although one of my adversaries had tried to put the pressure down in the tyres to make sure they arrived late. But it was that sort of election. But what I'd learnt at that time was the importance of showing that we were talking sense, not just about devolution and about the economy and about Europe, but also about day-to-day matters. Disability politics was very close to my heart because of the difficulty we had at home. We lost 2 boys. And I was lucky enough in 1981 to get a Disabled Persons Act onto the statute book, using parliamentary devices that are usually not used. And that gave a boost. And there were a number of one-off campaigns like that, campaigns such as the price of water in Wales, which was a scandal at that time, where we were able to latch onto issues and project the fact that we were standing up for Wales.
The personal tragedy, the loss of 2 sons, overtook your political career. You had to take a back seat. But it did instill in you this tremendous verve of campaigning on disability issues.
Yes, I felt that I had been put in that position by whatever fluke it was, that I was in the right place at the right time to stand up and to work with people like Jack Ashley, who was a tremendous campaigner, Alf Morris, Lewis Carter-Jones, great people, and working across party lines in order to get some progress for disabled people. And that was something that kept me going. When you're in a small party, as you probably, if you think back far enough, you can remember, you can be in a lonely position, and you need small victories to keep your batteries charged. And that's what was happening with the disability campaign and with a number of campaigns we had during that period. One of the important things I had at that stage that I felt very strongly about was the European dimension. Plaid had campaigned in '75 against our continued membership of the European community, as it then was. I felt very strongly that we should be in, and I'm afraid I broke party ranks. And in the fullness of time, by the end of the '80s, the whole party had come round to accept that self-government, independence in Europe was the sensible, the only real context for a small country like Wales. And that's why what's going on now has this particular poignancy for me.
I had some experience of breaking party ranks as well in my younger days, but by the 90s, both of us were back in Parliament, and the political fortunes were starting to swing in favour of Scotland and indeed of Wales.
Yes, they were. The '87 election, when you came in, and Margaret Ewing was with you, and Andrew Welsh, if I remember right. We had 3 members. You had a couple who joined you one by-election, and another person crossed the floor to join you. That gave you 5. So we were a well-balanced team, and we were able to work together at that time. And the changes that were happening in Scotland, I think John Smith was realising that the claim of right basis in Scotland, that the power comes from the people and not from establishments, should have justified getting a Scottish Parliament back in 1979, and he regarded it, as you well know, as his unfinished business. And because that momentum was building up in Scotland, and because there were changes happening in Northern Ireland, which John Major, my parliamentary peer, was involved very much in.
Prime Minister at the time.
Yes, Prime Minister at the time. And he was recognising that if the people of Northern Ireland voted for a reunification of Ireland, that should happen. And he said if the people of Scotland or Wales voted for independence, he would be very sad about it, but he would respect it. And that was, in a way, that claim of right, the recognition that our nations had the legitimacy to make that decision. And that gave an urgency then for us to be able to use that opportunity later in the 90s as it came.
Now, as a young leader of the SNP in the 1990s, I rather modelled my campaigning style on your up and at them verb.
Am I to blame?
Perhaps. But how much did you consciously see the opportunity of progressing Wales's claim in the lee of Scotland's advance?
Well, of course, Scotland's advance was a tremendous boost for us. So the two parties have been very close together. And sometimes Plaid in the 1960s was a little bit ahead, and then the SNP was a little bit ahead. We came back in the late 70s, early 80s. And therefore, we were inspiring each other. And that was a great thing. But there were also several other changes that took place from the referendum in 1979 to 1997. For example, we had 4 Secretaries of State for Wales that weren't even Welsh MPs. These were Tories. People like John Redwood, you know,
who had some difficulty with the Welsh national anthem, as I remember.
Yes, there's a lesson for us all there. If you don't know the words, don't try miming them, because that clip of film was used ever after. But the point was, the decisions were being taken by Secretaries of State that weren't in any way answerable to Wales. Some of them were good people. Peter Walker was a good person, and we worked closely with people like that, and David Hunt and William Hague. But that highlighted the democratic deficit that existed in Wales. We were governed by a whole load of quangos, the Welsh Development Agency and bodies like that, that again were answerable to a non-Welsh Secretary of State and not to the people of Wales. We also had the European dimension. The decisions were being taken in Brussels and we weren't getting a direct voice there. So these gave the opportunity to project the need for us to have control over our own affairs.
I want to ask you one specific question about Europe, which has always fascinated me. You and I, in the Maastricht process, were both busy doing deals in the House of Commons. We did a deal in the Committee of the Regions, something we supported, and we supported the Maastricht Treaty, of course. In Scotland, doing this deal with John Major on something we supported was regarded as an enormous betrayal, despite the benefits. But in Wales, of course, you were greeted as a national hero for securing these seats. Why the difference, do you think?
Well, I wouldn't say that as a national hero, but what matters is the contents of what you're negotiating. And if people see that the package that you're getting, and we got a package that included 3 things, yes, the Committee of the Regions, but also Interreg funding, which helped Western Wales linking up with Ireland, and we got an all-Wales body representing local government and MPs to debate 2 or 3 times a year the question of Wales's role in Europe. Now, and that was an embryonic parliament, if you like, and it showed the need for us to have that parliament in a European context. So all these things, it wasn't the fact that we were negotiating. People didn't mind what we negotiated with who, if we could deliver things that were beneficial for Wales.
So we're back to referendums with the incoming Labour government, resoundingly carried in Scotland and carried by a whisker in Wales, but still carried.
Still carried. I mean, that night I'll never forget, because the smaller, urban authorities were the ones that brought their results in first. And these were all going against us. It was like a football match when you're coming up to half-time, it goes 2-0, 4-0, 7-0, 10-0 at half-time. Oh, no
Some
chance.
football match.
And then in the second half, it came around. And the final announcement was in Gwynfo's old area, Carmarthen. And Carmarthenshire came through and enough to swing what would otherwise have been a no vote. And I wondered at that time whether Tony Blair would have honoured the outcome of the referendum. And he did, to his credit. And that reminds me, in the present context, that we also have to have an honouring of what people voted for, although I really hated the outcome of that referendum. In Scotland, you're in the fortunate position where people voted
You're talking about the Brexit vote?
Yes, the Brexit vote. We in Wales, of course, voted for Brexit by more or less the same pattern as in England. That was a great blow. But nonetheless, battles go on, but one must respect the view of the people. You can't just ignore it.
So you head into the 1999, the first elections for a Welsh National Assembly. You're at the head of your party, you've got a head of steam behind you, and you achieve a fantastic result, touching 30% of the vote.
Yes, there was a lot of luck in that. I mean, I couldn't believe that we had been just marginally ahead of the SNP at that time, which I never expected to be in that position. I think we were helped by the fact that Labour had chosen a leader, Alan Michael, who, although he was a very competent person, he didn't catch the imagination of the Labour Party, let alone the wider electorate. And because we were establishing a Welsh Parliament, for the first time, remember, since Owain Glyndŵr in 1400, we go back 600 years, that made people think, Plaid have something to offer here. This is Plaid seen. And they gave us the opportunity, and we came back with 17 members. Labour had 28 members, we had 17, and we had 30% of the vote. You
talk about the Labour leadership, but equally crucial was your leadership. You were, at that point, the best-known politician in Wales. You were the leader of the opposition. You were a household name. but within a year you'd decided to step down. What happened then?
Well, the worst thing that happened to me was that I had an awful shock that there was a defect on my heart, and I had to be rushed to Manchester. Really rushed. I went in for a scanning in Llandudno, and they looked at me and they said, "Oh, you're fine, go home." Oh, no. And they phoned immediately and got me through to Manchester, and I had a stent put in at that time. And that reminded one that we're all human mortals, and that things can go wrong. And there were also some divisions within the party in the Assembly. You know, then in the normal run of things, probably I'd have taken that head on. But given that I was under orders not to put additional stress on myself, I thought probably that was the best time to pass the bucket.
Well, you weren't the only opposition leader who stood down. I stood down at that time. But
well, I remember.
I came back again.
Yeah.
And obviously the SNP moved into government in 2007, then won resoundingly in 2011. Why wasn't, from virtually the same position in 1999, why didn't Plaid Cymru have that same upswing of success?
I think one of the reasons was that Labour ditched Alan Michael with our help. We orchestrated the vote of no confidence in him and gave Labour the opportunity to elect the person they wanted, Rhodri Morgan. Now, Rhodri Morgan was a charming person. He's dead now, of course, and we wouldn't not pay every homage to him for the role he played. What he did was to make the National Assembly relevant to people in their everyday lives. He was seen as the man in the street in Wales, and Labour benefited from that. We were out of focus for a while.
You also went into power in Wales as a junior partner in government, never an easy position.
That was after 2007. When we did have an opportunity then to form a coalition against Labour. And we were well on the road towards that. Plaid was the largest party, and we would then have been leading a government with support of Conservatives and Lib Dems. And the Lib Dems decided by a casting vote, I think it was the late Richard Livesey who cast that vote in their meeting, against coming into a coalition. Now, whether it would have worked or not, I don't know. I was out of the Assembly by then, of course. Ieuan Wyn-Jones was leading Plaid. And the question was, can you sustain with just a majority of one? Now, you sustained with a nil majority. But I think we would have been challenged, but we were up for it. And the opportunity didn't come. So when that went by the wayside, Plaid went into coalition with Labour in order to deliver things for Wales, particularly the constitutional change that brought us up to the same constitutional status as Scotland had, that a reserve powers model, which we hadn't had before. And it was necessary for us to go through that step to get a real parliament as opposed to a little bit of a talking shop as the Assembly was.
But then in 2010 you emerged back again, this time reincarnated in the House of Lords, the waiting room to heaven.
It was a shock for a lot of people. The background to that was this, that as the constitutional model stood in 2007 when the question arose and when I was elected by Plaid to be a nominee for the House of Lords, at that point in time, the only way that the National Assembly could make primary legislation was if an order came through both the House of Commons and the House of Lords approving on each individual instance. In other words, the non-elected House of Lords could head off the wishes of an elected government in Wales. And of course, we were in coalition in that government. So we needed a voice there to speak up were that to happen. In the fullness of time, I didn't get to the House of Lords until 2011, in fact. It was the end of 2010 the announcement was made, and I took my seat in 2011, because Gordon Brown had blocked me all the way through from 2007 to 2011. He was rumoured to have said over his dead body, would he see any nationalists in the House of Lords? I think it's the same stance, basically, as you took, Alex.
Well, we take a self-fulfilling stance, and we won't accept nomination. But if we had, then I wouldn't have expected Gordon Brown to be too favourable to any such nominations. But you now find yourself in that upper chamber, in that unelected chamber, in the middle of the maelstrom of the European Union legislation, the Brexit legislation, and playing a very prominent role in it.
Well, I found myself, because I'm so passionately in favour of Europe, I believe now that we have to get a package that meets certain minimum necessary steps for Wales and for Britain, because there's a British argument to some extent, with regards to having access to the single market, having customs union and this sort of thing, to make it practical. Otherwise, our manufacturing industry, very close to my heart, our farmers, and so many other sectors, tourism, would be devastated. And therefore, by being in the second chamber and being able to put amendments down to legislation on these matters, at least there's an opportunity to highlight them from a Welsh angle. And I have to work with people in all parties to do that. And of course, Europe is a subject that cuts across party divisions, so it's that much easier to form alliances.
So after all these years, when, as a young politician, you defied the Plaid Cymru line in the mid-70s to be in favour of Europe, you now find yourself respecting the result of the referendum, but I suspect sensing an opportunity for Wales in this European debate.
Oh, absolutely. I'm respecting the vote that took place, but I don't think people were voting for what would be the worst of a hard Brexit. If there was no agreement and we walked out having achieved nothing in the negotiations. Now, if that happens, then there has to be a second vote. Not a rerun of the previous referendum, but a confirmatory vote that people want to go out on that basis. And if they vote no, we stay in.
So looking at your career, as you rightly say, the National Assembly for Wales is the first body parliament in Wales for 600 years. Would that young David Wigley emerging in the House of Commons in February 1974 be pretty pleased with the progress that Wales has made over these last 40 years?
Can I say that in 1979, in March 1979, I would have been very pleased because it looked so grim then. In 1974, we thought that the progress would have come more quickly, but it didn't. And one has to work within the context of one's time and one's resources as a nation and one's own party resources. So we've moved forward. There's so much more to do. The greatest disappointment for me has been the failure of successive Labour governments to make progress on the economic agenda for Wales. We really are not getting anywhere on that one. And that is so close to my heart from my industrial past that that's the one thing I would have liked to have been in there to sort out.
And the constitutional future for Wales and the political future for Baron Wigley?
As far as Wales is concerned, it does depend so much on whether we stay in a meaningful way in unison with the European Union, if not a full member of it. If we're in what used to be called the Outer Seven, I think it was, wasn't it? There are countries like Sweden or Denmark of a like mind, people who are now outside the Eurozone, who might well, as I understand some thinking in continental Europe is moving in that direction for a two-speed Europe, then Britain may well still go into that common market type Europe as opposed to European Union type Europe, in which case Wales can find its level, as Scotland. What's important is that we don't have barriers between Wales and England, between Wales and Scotland or Ireland, that we're in together, because we want to build self-government and self-determination within a broader world, not cut ourselves off and look inwards on ourselves.
David Wigley, thank you so much for the interview.
Thanks, Alex.
From firebrand young MP to a baron on the red benches of the House of Lords, David Wigley was the most successful leader in the history of Plaid Cymru. The breakthrough at the first ever democratic elections for the National Assembly of Wales equalled that of the SNP in Scotland. However, the progress of the two parties has been remarkably different since, with the SNP becoming the dominant force in Scottish politics, while Plaid have struggled to remain in second place in Wales. Constitutional change has not been so different between the two countries, as the National Assembly has acquired lawmaking powers, with the Welsh moves forward often being but one step behind those of Scotland. Now, Brexit offers the opportunity to redefine Welsh nationalism for the next generation. It would be ironic if leaving Europe offered a fresh impetus to the cause of Wales, given that the Principality itself narrowly voted for Brexit. However, this changing landscape will belong to the party which is fleet of foot enough to seize the moment. And David Wigley believes that will be Plaid Cymru. But just a word before you go. Let's have a sneak preview of what's coming up next week in the Alex Salmond Show. From America, From the constitutional future of Wales across the Atlantic to Union Square in Manhattan. In the next three Alex Salmond shows, we'll be looking at the contribution of Scotland to modern-day America. Believe me, it's pretty lively stuff. In the second of our series, we'll be looking at political activism in these United States. And in the third, we'll be charting the political future of the United States of America. It's hard to know whether George Washington really realised what he was letting himself in for. See you then.